let me start by just noting that it's been a busy week in politics, and I'm going to speak with you about voting rights and voting suppression today, which I think is an important and looming battle in contemporary American politics. But before that, I just want to note that on the one hand, on Tuesday, we had the verdict in the Derek
Mm.
Chauvin trial. And of course, Chauvin was found guilty on 3 counts related to the murder of George Floyd, which had occurred essentially a year before and had launched the most sustained movement of protest politics in American history, focused, of course, on racial injustice in the criminal justice system and particularly in policing. And like I say, I'm about to focus on voting rights. And so I'll be focusing directly on issues to do with racial justice in part. And in the coming weeks, I'm going to speak with you more about this. It seems to me that we are at a particularly incendiary moment in
Yes.
American politics, and that the degree of racial mistrust and animosity and its instrumentalization by political racial entrepreneurs is really dangerous. And so next week I'll talk with you a little bit about anti-Asian
Mm.
violence and the wave of anti-Asian violence that has been occurring in the United States recently. But I do just want to point out that these issues go together, and the refrain we've heard with the Derek Chauvin conviction is that this is not justice, this is merely accountability. And I think that's exactly right, which is to say justice is equality in policing, equality in the criminal justice system, and more broadly speaking, the equal availability of physical and personal security in the United States, right? And so I'm not a big social media person, but some of these so-called memes come my way, and there's one out there about driving while black, jogging while black, sleeping while black, right? The various places that appear to be insecure for many African Americans in light of the way in which violence has been done in quite conspicuous ways just over the last year. And so to be clear, it is important, obviously, that we have accountability for police officers who abuse the power entrusted with them, especially when they do so in ways that are racist and in ways that are lethal. But having said that, there's much more to be done. And this is, just a single verdict in a battle that will go on for a long time. And it seems to me that thinking about voting rights and thinking about the capacity to engage in systemic reform is extremely important, especially in light of the verdict we just got, but also more broadly speaking, in light of the way in which the recording of George Floyd's murder, as I said to you a year ago, seems to be just the perfect map for racial subordination in 21st century America. And so the need to address that issue, not just through the criminal justice system when abuses of power come to light, but much more systemically through police reform, but through broader social reform as well. And here I think we have to remember, as awful as what Derek Chauvin did, it is in a sense psychologically understandable and predictable that the police associate threat, violence, and criminality with African American men because everyone in this society associates threat, violence, and criminality with African American men. It's a uh, cultural fact about our society. It is a vestige of our history of racism, but it's also the way in which our current popular culture constructs images of Black masculinity. And so much deeper reform would have to occur before that association loses its hold on us. The second thing I just wanted to note briefly about the contemporary political moment is, of course, that we just had a major climate summit and that the United States accelerated its climate change goals for 2030 and 2050. And I think there's an important shift in the discourse occurring. When I've lectured with you about this in the past couple of weeks, I've noted that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change did most of its calculations in its last report based on the idea that the goal for global climate change containment was 2 degrees Celsius. And I think there's a growing scientific and environmental consensus that's setting the bar too low. That 2 degrees Celsius climate change may already be uh, uh, irreversible, right? But nevertheless, it's going to be also catastrophic. And so I think part of the thing to notice in the reorientation, for instance, in the negotiations between John Kerry and the Chinese leadership that preceded the summit, was a communique that set the goal significantly below 2 degrees Celsius. And so we seem to be moving in the direction of, say, setting the ambition for 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that is going to be even more difficult to accomplish than would be setting the goal at 2 degrees Celsius. And yet, for the first time in maybe 6 years, there seems to be some motion in that direction. And I do, in a sense, wonder and hope that the experience with the global pandemic has maybe led us to focus a little bit more on the nature of global catastrophic risk and the imperative to do something about it before it's on our doorstep. All right, so that's just a couple quick comments on the news of the last week. Anybody want to say anything about that? I know for many of us, we held our collective breath, hoping that the verdict would come out in the right direction in the Chauvin case. And that for many of us, this has been not only extremely important, but also emotionally laden. The sense of relief that finally a police officer has been held to account in one of these highly visible instances of police violence, I think is palpable. And on the other hand, I think we have to be careful about assigning too much significance to the bottleneck of police accountability after the violence has occurred, and not think that we need to bend the standards of criminal justice to make sure that we address the problem of asymmetry in the criminal justice system exclusively through holding individual police officers accountable. If this is a systemic problem, it requires systemic solutions. And holding individual police officers accountable is not a systemic solution. Anybody, I'm sorry, I'm still editorializing, want to weigh in on either of those issues or anything else from the news of the last week?
Well, the fact that the Asian, whatever, anti-violence bill passed the Senate virtually unanimously, not quite, but is a good sign. And one would hope that they could extend that to all people.
Yeah, it is a good sign. And we'll talk more about this next week. It tends to be the case, frankly, that the coded racial language and the increasingly explicit racial language around Asians and African Americans and Latinos departs in significant ways. And so the anti-Asian racism, I'll suggest to you next week, is predictable in the current moment and is indicative of how much racial animosity has come to the surface, the fore in a certain kind of politics in the United States today. But it may also be, I would hope, a little easier to address or combat, at least for mainstream American politics. Flossie, did you put your hand up a moment ago?
Yes,
Yeah.
you know, there's some talk on Fox News possibly that the reason that the Chauvin verdict was finally just is that the jury, in its wisdom, decided that if it didn't deliver that verdict, there would be riots all over the US. It's possible, but that's the way it's being twisted. Not that that mixed jury was capable at one moment in its lifetime, their lifetime, that they acted together quickly, there wasn't that much debate, that they did the right thing. They saw it clearly. It's being twisted to mean that they did the cynical, the political thing. That happens too. That little bit of this. A
Yeah.
germ of truth, yeah.
And look, I don't think, right, we live in the realm of silver bullets, right? That you can't expect that even this verdict and the absolutely clear-cut and egregious nature of the case that was under consideration is going to instantly change everybody's mind, even about this particular case, right? But having said that, I tend to view it not through the lens of Fox News, you'll probably be unsurprised to hear, but instead through, first and foremost, the lens of African Americans, especially African American men of a broad age range, right? You know,
Wow.
kind of 14 to 50, where there's this constant, fear of police violence, and the idea that finally there's some accountability, I think is extremely important in indicating that the kind of politics that we've seen in the last year, and don't neglect the courageousness of that politics. So you can say people feared riots, but vast majority of the protests have been peaceful. That doesn't mean there hasn't been rioting and looting and violence. There has, but the vast majority has been very peaceful, right? And
I think it was a great moment in our history.
yes, and some sense that you know, the idea of Black Lives Matter is about a decade old now, and that it's some sense that perhaps we're in the midst of a new civil rights era, which gets me into the voting rights stuff in a moment, right?
Okay,
Again, that this is one of those scenarios where I think I want to look at a glass half full as opposed to a glass half empty, and I think you will know by now that's not my usual bent. All right, anybody else? Yes.
Yes, David, Wilma.
Go ahead, Wilma. Yep.
Yeah, just before we leave, making your point, it's not just a bad apple. It's the systemic issues we have. And there is a book that can help everyone understand that. It's about critical race theory. And the name of the book is Critical Race Theory, a Primer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's written by Kiara Bridges, who is currently a professor at Berkeley Law. Khiara Bridges, Kiara Bridges, and it will introduce you to the entire concept of structural racism in this country.
Thank you for that, Wilma. I'm going to add that to my reading list. And yes, systemic, structural, deeply rooted in our culture and our psychology, in the approach that we take to policing, but also recently instrumentalized in our politics, I think, in a different way. And that's in part where I want to go today in thinking about voting rights. So unless there's anybody else, okay, let me actually jump into then my prepared lecture for today. As I said, I want to speak with you about what I'm going to refer to as the new frontiers in the battle for voting rights and suppression in the 21st century. And as that title implies, I think we're actually at an interestingly bivalent moment. Right, ambivalent would be the standard way to put that idea, but the idea that we're moving in two different directions at once. And on the one hand, as I will attempt to demonstrate, we have important new voting rights legislation in front of the House of Representatives and the Senate at this moment. And this is obviously H.R. 1, which has already passed the House of Representatives, the so-called For the People Act, and also the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill, which would restore a fair bit of the Voting Rights Act that was invalidated in a Supreme Court decision, Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, and in a sense sets the context for everything else that's occurring in this country. And on the other hand, at the state level, we have a huge number of efforts to suppress the vote or to make it more difficult for people to vote. And so let me just start quickly with an overview. And I went to the Brennan Center website, which is a wonderful resource for this. And there are simply too many voting restriction bills on the legislative agenda at the state level right now to display. And the thing you can see here is this is one of 19 pages, right? So on page 1, we start in Arkansas and we get down to Arizona with Alabama in the middle. And that is, right, 20 of over 400 bills that are out there in the state level that aim to restrict the right to vote. And when I say restricted, a lot of this has to do with the ease of the ability to vote, whether that means that you are automatically registered when you get a driver's license, or that you need to show ID when you vote, or whether you can vote by mail. And I'll go into some of the details, but in a whole bunch of different ways, many states, 43 to be precise, are aiming to restrict the vote right now. We'll get into the details, but here's the ambivalence of this, right? There are actually more bills in state legislatures that aim to expand or ease the right to vote. More than 700 bills, right? And so this is really a moment in which our state level politics is moving in two directions at once. And although I think a lot of attention, at least in the circles I move in, tends to be focused on voter suppression, restricting rights, and the implicit racial agenda behind them, and I'll say just more about that in just a moment, it's worthwhile noting that there is a countervailing tendency as well, or at least countervailing aspirations and efforts. And so what we should immediately note is that if we focus on the voting restriction legislation, there's a clear partisan tilt to it, which is to say, and we could do this the opposite way, if we looked at the bills that aim to make it easier to vote, they are almost exclusively sponsored by Democrats. When we look at the bills that aim to restrict or make it more difficult to vote, they're almost exclusively sponsored by Republicans. So some of them are sponsored by conservative Democratic state legislators in conservative states, but they're bucking the trend. And so in a sense, what really matters, it seems to me, in thinking about which of these two countervailing or cross-cutting trends is likely to succeed is who controls which states, right? And this is the updated version of this map from the aftermath of the 2020 elections. And what we see is that there are 19 states in which the Republicans have a so-called trifecta, and this diagram shows actually trifecta and triplex. Trifecta means both houses of the state legislature and the governorship are controlled by the Republicans. Triplex means the governorship, the attorney generalship, and the head of the state supreme or highest court are controlled by Republican or Republican appointed officials, right? And so it's in those states where Republicans have the capacity to unilaterally legislate that I think we have to be most worried about this, and especially in those states where the Republican unilateral capacity to legislate is unchecked by other legal officials in the state. And that means that there are roughly 19 states that we should be really worried about, despite the fact that these bills have been introduced in 43 states. Now, one of the big questions here, and I want to get into some of the details of how this legislation works, but why now? And one of the things that I want to try to argue today is that this is absolutely not true. And some of you may be familiar with the author Carol Anderson, I think a very gifted professor of history who concentrates on issues to do with the racial history of the United States. She's the author of the book White Rage, and more recently, One Person, No Vote. The history she tells there is one of continuous voter suppression in the United States from the aftermath of the Civil War through 2016, right? And so I think in a sense the issue is not why now, because it's been continuous, but is there something distinctive going on at the moment? And clearly I do think there is, and you may have noticed the title of the graphic, which is taken from 538, Republican legislatures are pushing the big lie at the state level. Of course, the big lie is that the 2020 presidential election was stolen through voter fraud, right? And that in particular mail-in ballots, but you know, there are all kinds of theories floating around out there about how this worked, whether it's voting machines or people voting in multiple places or corrupt state officials, but that the only way that Joe Biden won was by stealing the election, and that therefore to prevent this again, we need tougher restrictions, tougher surveillance and supervision on the vote. And I have to say, I have obviously absolutely no sympathy for the idea that the 2020 vote was stolen. But it does appear that we have an intersection of highly cynical voting calculus here on the part of elected officials. I just find it hard to believe that many of the people who are sponsoring this legislation actually believe that the outcome of the 2020 vote was stolen. And the way in which we see this in part is when people go in front of courts and under oath and susceptible to prosecution if they perjure themselves or lie, are asked to document voting fraud, of course they are unable to. And the same is true when people go to congressional hearings about voting fraud and under oath, including state officials who are sponsoring legislation with the rationale that there is widespread voting fraud. Under oath in front of Congress, they admit that the number of cases of proven voting fraud in the United States in the last 20 years is about 30. Right? That it just couldn't possibly change the outcome of any election, that it is not a systematic or widespread problem in the United States. But having said that, in addition to the fact that there is a cynical ploy being used by almost exclusively Republican officials to indicate their continued allegiance to Donald Trump, who was the primary author of this voting fraud narrative about 2020, there is perhaps widespread, genuine belief that voting fraud did occur on the part of an important segment of the Republican electorate. And again, I think that's part of what we've got to get our heads around, is that maybe 40, 50% of Republican voters in the United States today believe that fraud occurred in 2020, and that's the reason that Joe Biden is president. And that is, I think, just a sobering fact to have to reckon with, and it sets the stage for much else of what I'm going to talk about. So, right, I think we should anticipate that this legislation will pass in most of these states when you bring together the cynical calculus of political leaders and the sincere belief of many Republican voters that fraud was so widespread that it determined the outcome of the 2020 election. And one of the things that Carol Anderson's book does is it traces genealogically the origins of the idea of voter fraud and the way it emerged in the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 as an alternative way of justifying voting restrictions once the old mechanisms of the Jim Crow South had broken down. So with that background, let me go a little bit into the kinds of restrictions that are currently on the agendas of various state legislatures, right? And so perhaps the most important is to restrict mail and early voting, right? And that has been proposed in 33 states, and this diagram shows you states in which no bills have been introduced. The deep blue ones are states in which mail restriction has been proposed. The light blue ones are states in which early in-person restrictions have been proposed. And of course, as you see, many of the states that have proposed restrictions have proposed both kinds of restrictions. You can also see that the number of people who could face these kinds of restrictions is substantial. And as you can see, right, in particular, that it's most substantial in red states or Republican-leaning states. States that voted for Donald Trump are colored in red. And you can also see by the size of the dot the number of voters that could possibly be affected by these measures. There's also, an effort underway to require an excuse for an absentee ballot. And so voting by mail and an absentee ballot are slightly different, right, legal categories, right? Vote by mail, you don't have to be absent from the state, whereas an absentee ballot, typically you have to say that you are not present at the time of the vote. And as you can see, there are already 16 states, including my home state of New York, that require an excuse to request an absentee ballot. New York has some reform in the works, and hopefully it will change. But as I say, we're moving in two directions at once. And I think the more disturbing direction is obviously the restriction of access to absentee voting. And it does look like 6 states are considering legislation to require an excuse that don't currently require an excuse. And 4 of those states, it looks like there's a pretty good chance those bills have a chance, will pass, in fact. Now, there's one more thing that I think is really important in understanding these measures, and that is a significant change in both the demographics and the political geography of the electorate. And this is a diagram taken from Ezra Klein's Why Are We So Polarized? And I think it's, you know, a little hard to follow, but actually quite interesting, quite illuminating. And so what the diagram shows is that in 1916, the majority of the votes for Democrats, or I should say the largest share of the vote for Democrats, came from low density population areas, counties typically. And so right to the left of the diagram, that's the low population areas. And that by the time you get to 2016, the vast majority of Democratic votes are coming from high population census tracts with a lot of population density, that is to say urban areas. Another way to look at this is to go back to Bill Clinton's victories in the 1990s and to notice that he won roughly half the counties in the United States, and there are over 3,000 counties in the United States. You may know that Donald Trump's favorite political map was a map of how many counties he won and how many counties Hillary Clinton won. And that's because he won 2,500 counties to Clinton's 500 counties. Now, please note, Clinton nevertheless won the popular vote. And so there are 2 things that I think that reveals. One of them is that we have become a much more urbanized country over the last 100 years, right? The majority of our population now lives in densely populated urban areas. But the second thing that it reveals, and again, this is, I think, quite obvious, is that the people who vote Republican tend not to live in urban areas. The people who vote Democratic do tend to live in urban areas. And part of the reason that I emphasize this in this context is because that means that there are different requirements for people who are voting in urban areas than there are for people who are voting in rural areas. Population density encourages you, if you want to make it easier for people to vote, to have more voting stations, to have drop-off ballot boxes in various places that make it easy for people to get to them, right? The image that I showed at the beginning of this slideshow, I'll just go back to very briefly, is an image of a vast line to vote, right? And part of what can be done to suppress the vote in light of this data is simply to make it harder to vote in high density places, to decrease the number of polling stations, to decrease the hour in those polling stations. And I think we should absolutely expect that that will occur. Now, I wanted to just provide that basic factual background. In the remainder of the lecture, I want to talk about two things. One of them is what I believe will be the looming battles. And the first and perhaps most important one is the question about whether voting restrictions will succeed in suppressing voting. And the political science literature on this is actually very interesting. It seems to indicate that making it easier to vote does not dramatically increase the number of people who vote or dramatically shift the nature of the electorate. And I'm going to talk about Steph Curry here for a moment. And, apologies to those of you who are not basketball fans, but it's hard to, be in April 2021 and not want to think about Steph Curry if you are a basketball fan. One of the things I've been noticing about Curry is that when he thinks he's been fouled, right, but the foul hasn't been called, very often he goes back and he scores on the next possession, right? And it doesn't matter the level of difficulty, and it's fun to watch. Tell me, if those of you who are Warriors fans, if you think my generalization is a valid generalization. The point is that sometimes when you do something unfair and you get away with it, the effect is to rile up or anger or motivate the person you're treating unfairly, right? And that's not the totality of the explanation for why it is that people who study voting restrictions tend to find that they're not necessarily very effective at suppressing the vote. And so please note, there are two different terms at work here: voting restrictions and voting suppression. Right? And voting restrictions are things that make it more difficult to vote. Voting suppression is a successful effort to keep a subgroup from voting. And that subgroup could be a partisan subgroup to make it more difficult for Democrats to win elections, or it could be a racial subgroup, or it could be a class-based or geographic subgroup, right? So there are various efforts along these lines. And the question is, given that this is occurring under tremendous scrutiny, right? We're all aware of what's happening. Will the Stacey Abrams of the world succeed in just getting better organized once new voting restriction plans are put in place? And I do think that there's a chance that this could actually backfire, which is to say, the desperate effort to prevent people from voting. And let me just be as clear as possible about this. I really should have mentioned this at the beginning. There's a line in Supreme Court decisions about voting, which calls voting a preservative right. It's a right that people use to preserve all of their other rights. And so if you are deprived of the right to vote, then your other civil rights are in danger. And of course, when we look at the history of the Jim Crow South, this is exactly what we see, right? Which is to say that white Dixiecrats deliberately and violently disenfranchised African Americans, in part because they recognized that if they didn't, African Americans would use the vote to change the composition of the legislature, to then change the law, to then have greater opportunity and equality in the South, right? And so the entire social structure of the South as white supremacists depended upon preventing African Americans from voting. Because people like Stacey Abrams understand this so clearly, their reaction to voting restrictions may be to redouble their voting turnout, their organizing campaigns, and thereby, in fact, to counteract effectively the effect of the voting restriction so it does not result in voting suppression. Please note also, right, that Georgia has been out in the lead on this. Georgia, which of course decided the outcome of the control of the Senate. And that what we see is that many major corporations and Major League Baseball are now punishing Georgia for having passed this legislation. And so this is a complex cauldron of political forces at work in the United States in 2021. This is not 1875 or 1955. So having said that, the next big looming battle is the battle for two efforts at the national level to protect voting rights. And H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which has passed the House of Representatives already in 2021 and is on its way to the Senate, and passed the House of Representatives in 2018 as well, also numbered H.R. 1, right? So House of Representatives 1, that is to say it's the first bill to pass the House in the new legislative session, deliberately prioritized in that way in order to symbolize its significance. And it's arrived in the Senate, and it is probably dead on arrival in the sense that it will be filibustered. And so as you can see, I've linked the filibuster with both H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And I want to be as clear as possible about this. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had 5 sections to it, right? And the 5th section required that states with a history of voting discrimination receive pre-approval for any material changes in their voting regulations from the Department of Justice. And in 2013, in a Supreme Court decision in the case of Shelby County v. Holder, authored by John Roberts, that provision was struck down, and Roberts' decision seemed to turn on at least 2 ideas, one of them being that the South of 2013 was not the South of 1965. I will come back to that in a few minutes. And I will point out to you that if by indicating a historical difference between the southern states in the 2nd decade of the 21st century as opposed to the 6th decade of the 20th century, Roberts meant that there's less effort to suppress the vote of African Americans. The historical record seems to show that he was mistaken about that. And part of what we have seen is a proliferation, a landslide, an avalanche of efforts to make it more difficult for targeted populations to vote, including in North Carolina, where the legislature actually requested data on African American voting patterns. How much do they engage in absentee balloting? How much do they take advantage of early voting on Saturday? And then precisely, and as the court observes, surgically attacked those forms of voting that African Americans were most likely to use in that state. And so in that sense, it seems that Roberts is wrong. The thing that I want to focus on when we get into the history in a few minutes is, and I'll just preview this for a moment, when we look at the way in which voter suppression operated in the Jim Crow South, it depended upon two things: legal measures to make it impossible for African Americans to vote. I'll get into the details of that, but then also state and vigilante terror. And right, the stories in Carol Anderson's book are just truly awful, of people who register to vote, and 2 days later the Klan shows up at their doorstep and assassinates them, or even worse, shoots them, and then they're taken to the local hospital, and the local hospital refuses to treat them, right? And so one thing I think Roberts is right about is that we don't have that vigilante form of terrorizing the African American population if they assert their right to vote. Now, you might see aspects of this in the Georgia legislation. The idea that people will not be allowed to bring water and food to people waiting in long lines to vote might have a bit of that feel to it to you. But there's a world of difference, it seems to me, between that and what was happening 60 years ago on a regular basis. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act aims to restore some of the provisions that were struck down by the Supreme Court in 2013. H.R. 1, in addition to making voting registration automatic or very easy, allowing people a right to vote by mail, also attacks partisan gerrymandering, and that's something we're going to get into in just a moment. But what I would say to you is both of these bills are dead on arrival in the Senate unless and until the Democrats decide to revoke or restrict the filibuster. And right now, that does not seem to be in the cards, but there is movement in that direction. And it does seem to me that, in a sense, if there is any issue that is likely to motivate the Democrats to reconsider the filibuster or consider restricting it or making it more difficult or partially removing it, it is probably issues to do with voting rights, especially if there is a wave of voting restriction legislation at the state level. Third issue has to do with the tilt of the courts. And so assuming that there is a new wave, an avalanche of voting restriction legislation, a fair bit of it, of course, will end up in the courts. And what we're going to see, and this brings, I think, to the fore another very important dimension to this. And I've indicated, right, that voting restriction legislation has been in place in this country since its inception, has never gone away, and has simply morphed or evolved as our political conditions have changed. And part of the reason to point that out is to point out the partisan calculus that has supported voting restrictions. And I think it's important to remember that it's the Democratic Party that was the engineer of the Jim Crow voting restriction legislation, which was much more vicious and effective than any of the current proposals. Why did the Democratic Party do this? Well, I'm going to point to the great mid-20th century American political scientist, V.O.K., that's Key, K-E-Y, I think pronounced K, who basically said, really, the Democratic Party in the middle of the 20th century was an alliance between two parties: the Democratic Party outside the South and the Dixiecratic Party in the South. And that, in a sense, the Dixiecratic Party conducted its foreign policy with the rest of the United States, which was primarily dedicated to preserving racial hierarchy in the South by working within the Democratic Party. And that the Democrats who were not Southern accepted the Dixiecrats because it worked to their political interest to do so. They were able, for instance, to pass the New Deal legislation with the support of the Dixiecrats on the condition, of course, that they exclude African Americans from most of the benefits like Social Security and Medicare. And they didn't do that through explicit racist language. They did it through excluding various categories of employment that were dominantly African American categories, such as agricultural work and domestic labor and train porters, right? Why can't train porters get Social Security? Because the Southern Dixiecrats didn't want any indication in New Deal legislation that any citizens' rights were going to African Americans. Now, having given all of that background, the courts, of course, have been very important ultimately in striking that legislation down. And should we expect that the courts will do so today? And I have to say, not optimistic. And the reason has to do with the ideological tilt of the court. And the simple fact here is that Republicans have won the popular presidential vote once in the last 8 presidential elections, but Republican appointees to the Supreme Court fill 6 of the 9 seats on the court. And the reason that I bring that in this moment is to point out to you that the Republican Party in the 21st century made a calculus very much like the Democratic calculus in the middle of the 20th century, which is that it suits their political interests to play the race card in politics and to do so in order to suppress the vote, that they have stacked the courts, and that it seems to me unlikely, therefore, that if this legislation passes, there will be much redress in the courts. Final issue I want to raise in terms of the looming battles has to do with the fact that it's worthwhile remembering we have another round of redistricting occurring. And the deepest question here, it seems to me, is one about the Republican Party's willingness to embrace a strategy of minoritarian rule. That is to say, trying to hold on to most of the power in the country, despite the fact that voters tend to prefer Democrats. Not all of them, but as I just said, 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections, the popular vote winner was a Democrat. And again, more people vote Democratic in congressional elections than vote for Republicans. If you are nevertheless going to hold on to power, there are things that have to be done. You have to try to prevent people from voting. You have to try to district in a way that increases your capacity to receive representation without receiving a majority of the vote. And of course, you rely on the way in which the Constitution amplifies the power of the least populous states. So I don't think I'm going to have time to go through this entire history. I just want to point out to you that the way in which Jim Crow voter suppression was in part through voting restriction, right? Was in part through legal measures and literacy restrictions when, of course, the South didn't fund education for African Americans. There were states that didn't have high schools for African Americans that nevertheless imposed literacy requirements in order to be able to vote. So-called understanding restrictions, which said you had to understand every provision of the state constitution. And then, of course, states like Alabama and Mississippi deliberately wrote their constitutions to be difficult to understand, knowing that the registrar of voters would not ask white voters to explain the arcane provisions, but would ask black voters. Poll tax restrictions, registration restrictions, right? There were myriad ways in which, and I should have put on here, of course, white-only primaries, which were used effectively throughout much of the South for the first 2/3 of the 20th century. But I also want to point out that state and vigilante terrorism, right? State terrorism done by the sheriffs or the police officers or even the National Guard troops of a state, right? But also then the Ku Klux Klan and just random, I shouldn't say random, organized acts of violence on the part of ordinary white people against black people. And that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was probably only passed because of the Cold War context and how embarrassing it was for the United States to try to make the case for democracy in the world when it functioned as a system of apartheid racial hierarchy in the South, that really did undo these legislative measures and created conditions in which the Southern state and Ku Klux Klan and other organizations could no longer terrorize any African Americans who aimed to vote, and that although the Voting Rights Act has been undone, and although new measures to suppress the vote are therefore making a lot of headway in many states, it still is not the case that we are experiencing the kind of racially organized intimidation campaigns that were promoted and so effective in the South in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. And so that leads me to conclude with a question. Are we moving in that direction again? And that is the question, in a sense, that I will return to next week when I think about anti-Asian violence in the United States, and more generally, the mobilization of racial violence as part of an entrepreneurial electoral strategy in the contemporary United States. It was open and uncontested in the South from the end of Reconstruction until the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Is it possible that we could be moving in that direction again? Is the question I'll come back to you with next week. I'll stop there. I know I've left rather little time, but I'm happy to take whatever questions, thoughts, comments you might have. Who wants to start us out? Is this familiar history, or is this stuff that we've tried to forget in a sense? Suzanne, are you raising your hand? Please go ahead, but you'll have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I just want to say, having a historical perspective on all of these things, looking at it throughout the 20th century is key, because it, you know, the fact that the 1965 Voting Act was part of the Cold War, and that refugees were only people who were coming here from communist countries, etc. I think that looking at it not in isolation, but in, you know, the full historical context is really important.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Suzanne. And like I say, I strongly recommend Carol Anderson's One Person, No Vote. She's a wonderful historian. She writes in a very accessible way. She tells ordinary stories, but she's meticulous in her research too. Among the things she illuminates is that Jeff Sessions, right, who obviously came to prominence eventually in the Senate and then as Trump's attorney general, actually started his career in the Reagan Department of Justice and pioneered in many ways the voting fraud strategy of the Republican Party, in particular going after voting rights activists in the South in the early 1980s who recognized that part of the reason, for instance, that white officials had a monopoly on power in the Black Belt of Alabama, right, the area in Alabama that is majority African American, is because of the way in which the absentee ballot was being manipulated. And when Black activists decided to try to use the absentee ballot to get the elderly or the infirm or the people whose work schedules did not let them show up for the 4 hours that polls were open on Tuesdays to vote, Jeff Sessions prosecuted them for voter fraud and used the full weight of the state, the federal government, to try to shut down voting initiatives in the Deep South. And so, yes, the history is important here. John Campbell's recommending to us a podcast called The Improvement Association. And I am unaware of it, but I have the experience that usually what he recommends is very illuminating. So I'll just second his recommendation in a blind way. Anybody else? All right. Enjoy your weekends, and I'll look forward to seeing you next month when we will talk in the first instance about racial violence in the United States. And then I want to come back to thinking about the role of parties, because, right, one of the big questions here is why for so long did Northern Democrats put up with the Dixiecratic support for racial oppression, right? And why is it that the Republican Party has decided to embrace this strategy of voter suppression when it seems that it's clearly a long-term dead end? What's going on with parties in American democracy? That's a preview of where I hope to go with you a little bit in May. Take care, everyone. Be well. And I look forward to seeing you all next week, which happens to be next month. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.